Well, good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you are. Ed, welcome.
Thank you.
We are thrilled to have you, as I've now told you many, many times. Your book here, Material World, the 6 raw materials that have shaped the modern civilization, is something that is very near and dear to our heart. We talk about all the time the importance of the way the world actually works as opposed to the way that we wished it worked. And this is a tremendous read from an award-winning journalist and author of 3 books now, this just being the latest. I want to speak up front, ask some questions, talk about what you talk about, but then really, open it up to the group here. Ed was named the economics editor of Daily Telegraph and the Sunday Telegraph when he was just 25 years old. And I guess your day job now is being the economics and data editor for Sky News. Salt, sand, iron, copper, lithium, and oil.
Yes.
Yes. What was 6 and 7?
I was going to do wood. So I was going to have
aluminum.
wood. And aluminum was an option as well. Yeah. But in the end, you'll see the book, it's kind of pretty thick already. and I kind of, as I wrote the sand section, I had no conception that it was going to be so interesting. Like every single time I went down various kind of rabbit holes, I'd be like, well, that's amazing. So I'm a journalist and I love stories and I love things that feel like they are new. And within a lot of this world, there is so much that I imagine, you and your colleagues will be familiar with, because you guys, I was just saying earlier, you're denizens of the material world. But for a lot of people, this is just complete news. A lot of people just don't really have a conception of how the world actually works and how their standard of living is brought about. And so each time I would go down various different rabbit holes and I would be, oh, that's just amazing, but also surprising. So for instance, glass was my first chapter that I wrote, and I thought, when I first started off on it, I thought, there's no way this is going to be more than, I don't know, like a couple of thousand words. And then the more you get into it, the more fascinating it is, because it's a story of history. It's the oldest kind of advanced technology, and it's that is the silicon technology of its day. And yet it, and also responsible for so many of the scientific breakthroughs of history. But like even today, if we're communicating with people on the other side of the world, thanks to fiber optics, glass is still a very physical, critical part of our infrastructure today, glass. And it's those things, I think, that remind people of the tangibility of the world that surrounds them in a way that feels intimate rather than just feeling like it's kind of...
Listen, we are thrilled that you're telling the story. This is going to be a lot of fun. I'm worried I'm going to go on and talk too much.
And if I start blathering, that's...
No, you're allowed to. Nobody wants to hear me blather. They want to hear you blather. But, it's been a real thing for us, right? We are industrial manufacturers. We are focused on innovation and technology inside the physical, but you call material world. And, spend all day, every day, deeply rooted in how things actually work. I think there's a question which we can come back to is like, why is this so foreign to most people? We, in a self-deprecating way, try and say, roofing or catalysts are not the sexiest business in the world, but they are.
If you know, you know.
If you know, you know. Exactly, right? But most people are very divorced. There's been lots of, geopolitical, economic, social, cultural history that can be told through these very basic physical things, which I think is one of the most interesting parts of the deep dive in your book. But this narrative of, hitting a light switch one day and just shifting from the way the world used to work to the way the world will work, without that real focus on the way the world currently works, is, I think, a big gap in our, society, for lack of better terms. And I think the more people like you, frankly, tell the story to the world, the more people will come around to, this is not our first energy transition.
No.
Every energy transition has replaced one problem with a new problem. Hard to conceive, and we're the largest solar roofing manufacturer in the world, so can tell you how that works. Really hard to conceive of how wind turbines, solar roofing, batteries, how that happens away from polymers and physical materials. So with that, maybe be fun to just up front get into each of the 6 a little bit, sort of how and why, a couple of anecdotes around them. But you said you started with glass, you started with sand, foundation of the modern world.
Yeah.
You know, how and why did you kind of get there?
Well, I guess like in a sense, the genesis of the book was that I recognised. So I cover economics, as you say, and I'm a journalist, and I've never made anything in my life, so I'm very conscious of that. And within my world of economics, you know, I live in the services sector. My living is ideas. There's nothing physical about it at all. And increasingly, you know, I think part of the answer to that kind of conundrum you were raising earlier about like why is it that so few people, so many people feel divorced from this. It's in some senses it's a positive thing. It's because there are fewer and fewer people working within industries that previously were quite hard and quite dirty industries. So, you know, agriculture used to be by far and away the biggest employer in this country, not, you know, kind of 150 years ago or so. It was the biggest employer in the UK, it was the biggest employer around the world, because everyone had to work at it because it was so hard to get enough crops out of the ground to feed everyone, you know, before the age of good steel, before the age of ploughs, before the age of chemical fertilizers. And nowadays, there's the tiniest fraction of people working in the fields to produce the food that we need, and yet we're able to produce more food than ever before. And the similar things go for manufacturing and for mining. You know, there's fewer people working in mining, you know, in this country and certainly in my country as well, than have ever worked in those sectors before. And yet, part of that story is partly it's because we have become much better at kind of mechanizing a lot of these processes, and that's no bad thing in agriculture because it's tough. It's no bad thing in mining because it can be very dangerous. There's far fewer deaths that happen in mining. But the upshot of that is that there are just fewer people within everyone's social networks that have any kind of physical connection with how chemicals are made and how mining happens and how the products that we use on a daily basis actually come about. In the course of researching this book, you know, I spent a lot of time kind of going into various different archives, and one of them, kind of an amazing resource, is the ICI archive. So Imperial Chemical Industries in the UK used to be this giant. It was one of the giants of chemical manufacturing around the world, and it now no longer exists. It's been kind of taken apart essentially. But back in the 1950s, they had I think it was maybe every week or every month, there was literally a newspaper that they used to produce, which went out to the tens of thousands of people who worked within ICI, and their families would read it as well, and they would understand about this amazing new fabric that's been produced, or this amazing type of paint, or this amazing chemical that's helping, you know, us improve our standard of living. And so there was something much more intimate, I think, about here's how we take stuff out of the ground, turn it into products, and bring it into your world. And I think there is something quite visceral, quite primal. We are, what is it that defines us as a species? It is that we take stuff out of the ground, we turn it into tools, and we use those tools to improve our standard of living. Like, that is part of what being human is. It's part of us. And yet there's fewer and fewer people actually doing that stuff, and therefore we have become disconnected. And to some extent, I think part of the reason why, for a lot of people outside of this material, well, you know, in my world of kind of ideas and all of that nonsense, why a lot of people do feel a connection with some of these stories is because there is something that important about being human, about getting stuff out of the ground. And, you know, we can talk about some of the compromises. But let's see, now I've just blathered on because you were asking about whether
we're going to get to the compromises. I think, we're not even 10 minutes into this. I want to see how long I can get without using the word tariff.
Well, I mean, I'm very happy to talk about tariffs.
But so far, I just
do you want me to do sands, though?
But I think it'd be helpful. Just go through the six and a little bit of how you kind of got there. And,
sure.
I mean, I think there was a comment that, you know, for something to, you know, qualify, it has to be good, it has to be cheap, and it has to be scalable.
You're making it seem far more scientific than it really was in the first place.
Well, that's why we have hindsight. So,
well, I mean, I wished at the start of this, because I started with this from this conception that, hang on, I was actually at this gold mine and I was watching the process of gold mining. I'd never really thought, I guess, about how like a bit of gold actually comes out of the ground, and I found it kind of. The enormity of this mine was just, it was kind of mind-blowing. It was this massive mine in Nevada. And the scale of destruction you need to do to just take this mountain and basically kind of grind it down into granules and then process it into gold. I just didn't know that is how gold actually kind of most gold gets into our hands. And then it struck me, well, if that's the story for gold, then what is the story going to be for the other stuff that we clearly need? And then that kind of sent me down a terrifying kind of vertiginous rabbit hole, which is like, hang on, what is the stuff we need? What are the things that without which the rest of civilization, whether it's data centers or everything else, just wouldn't be able to function? And that question, this kind of journalistic thing about asking stupid questions, is sometimes quite enlightening. There wasn't really a simple answer to that. I thought that there would be some database or some spreadsheet somewhere which would be able to say, okay, well, there is this much copper in the global economy. Okay, and here is the kind of map, the nodes, the different companies which depend on that copper. Because clearly, if you're involved with anything electrical, you need copper. Clearly, if you're making data centers, you need copper. Clearly, if you're kind of producing, anything that involves kind of thought these days, it involves copper. So there's a massive dependency on simple materials, and yet no one has really done that work of understanding the interlinkages of dependency. So there was no spreadsheet. So I just had a lot of conversations. It was a journalistic exercise. I spoke to quite a lot of people. I went through, a whole list of different materials. It wasn't originally, so for instance, the battery material that I have in there wasn't originally going to be lithium. It was going to be cobalt.
Yeah, I saw that.
But then
you had to pick one.
Yeah, and then I had to pick one, and so one of the things that kind of I kept coming back to, which is this old. When I started trying to understand economics, because I'm kind of self-taught. Well, I did eventually go into a course in economics, but I originally did English at university, which these days is not very fashionable, but back when I did it, it was quite popular. And one of the essays that I read that really kind of stayed with me when I was trying to understand economics was this essay called I, Pencil by a guy called Leonard Read, written back in the 1950s. And it's really simple. He just takes a pencil and says, and from the pencil's perspective, I'm a pencil. I'm one of the simplest things in the world. And yet there is no single person who knows how to make me. Every different part of this pencil, whether it's the graphite that goes into the lead, whether it's the wood that comes from a cedar forest on the other side of the world, whether it's the metal that attaches the eraser, whether it's the eraser itself, these are all what we would today call supply chains, but these are maps, interlinkages of different processes that involve thousands of different people who have no connection with each other coming together to make an incredibly simple product. There is no single person who is making that pencil. And it struck me when I was reading that essay, that is kind of mind-blowing. And I would love to be able to do that exercise for everything that surrounds us. I think that would be an amazing thing to do. And so when I started thinking about this, I thought, well, what would that process be for something like a silicon chip, which is the ultimate technological invention we have these days? And so you had Chris Miller here recently, and he wrote this amazing book. And actually, he was writing it while I was writing mine, and we kind of corresponded a bit. So I saw an early edition. It's an amazing work.
Book.
It's brilliant. But he deals with mostly what's happening at these fabrication plants where the incredibly high-tech stuff is happening. And you'll all know about that stuff already, so happily I don't have to go through all of that. But by the time a silicon wafer has arrived, at the start of his supply chain, by the time a silicon wafer has arrived at those fabrication plants, it has already been through this amazing journey where it has been around the world a number of times potentially. Those atoms of silicon, they came out of the ground in a quarry. They've been kind of processed and processed and processed again. They've been changed into something that is quite literally the most perfect thing that humankind can mass produce. The most perfect thing we can mass produce. And that's before it's actually reached the fabrication plant where it's then turned into a silicon chip. And that whole kind of hidden story about how you make the wafer that then goes into the plant and is owned, that full supply chain, the full iPencil story for the silicon chip, it had never really been told, and there was no template to go to try to kind of learn about that. And so I had to talk to a lot of people, and it was this funny experience of, I spoke to a few people within silicon chip manufacturing and said, well, we had various conversations about, how many nanometers it was and what the next kind of progression in photolithography was going to be. But then at the end I would say, well, okay, but where does the silicon come from?
Exactly.
Where does the silicon? And they'd be like,
yeah, I don't know.
Who cares?
Yeah.
Like it's like sand or something. I'd be like, well, is it though? And where does the sand come from? And is it a particular type of sand? And they'd be like, why are you asking these questions? And that for me was the interesting thing, because I think when you're touching your device or using your device, that is something that started by coming out of the ground.
Yeah.
It started by coming out of the ground, and by forgetting that, we forget the kind of, again, that link between humanity and the minerals and the stuff that we extract to turn into tools.
Yeah.
So I that was one of the reasons why the sand chapter ended up being incredibly, or the section ended up being incredibly long, because I needed to go on that journey, but then there was glass as well, and then concrete. I mean, obviously,
we need
you know all about concrete as well.
Yeah.
So that's just sand.
So I mean, listen, I think starting in sand was perfect sort of framing for the kind of the bigger questions. I mean, we talk about everything from Murano glass to missile guided kind of optics and semiconductors and things like that, but like eyeglasses, right? Like think of what percentage of the population would have been completely dysfunctional after a certain age without eyeglasses. So the necessity is clear. I think that story of from North Carolina to Taiwan is a pretty cool story. But the one I would love you to tell, everybody must read this book. It's been sitting on our reception for a long time, so if you haven't already seen it or stolen a copy, shame on you. Do it. But 1915, the Germans and the English. Tell us a little bit about glass for rubber, because I mean, obviously we're 100 years later, but the kind of the questions around globalization. I didn't use the word tariff. Are real questions, and I think the idea that we can, redundancy in supply chains, got it. Onshoring things, got it. Global health pandemics, not good. But the idea that we will not continue to be in a globalized world and specialization of labor, and we should all do everything, kind of, is a hard thing to wrap my brain around. Help us with the glass rubber trade story.
It's a really interesting one, because it echoes today, and I imagine we might end up talking about tariffs at some point soon.
We will. It's a
I feel it kind of approaching.
It's a big lead up.
So there's this amazing, to me, I hadn't heard this story before. In fact, it's very rarely been told. It begins, if I can kind of set the scene, it's 1915, and a spy has been sent from Britain to Switzerland to meet with his German counterpart. So Britain and Germany are at war. The troops are fighting in the trenches. It's awful. And a spy, the Brits send a spy to Germany, or at least to meet with their German counterpart, and it's to do a deal. And the deal is that that British spy wants to procure binoculars from the Germans. And it is like the saga of how we ended up in this situation where one party at war is willing to do a deal with the other party to buy something off it, goes back actually kind of almost 100 years. So for a long time, Britain was really very advanced in making optical glass. And we don't, like I say, that was the silicon technology of its day, advanced glass, being able to make lenses that enabled you to see further, or that enabled you to peer into the kind of microcosm of microscopic items. That was one of the most important breakthroughs, in human history, and actually enabled a lot of the scientific breakthroughs of understanding. A lot of different breakthroughs, whether it's splitting the atom, that involved actually kind of having glass receptacles to do that work in, whether it's Galileo peering into space. A lot of this depended on being able to make glass really well. So in a strange way, glass has got this kind of walk-on part in so much of scientific history. But anyway, so in Britain, we were pretty good at making glass. And then, as often happens when you get pretty good at making something, the industry starts generating a fair bit of money, and the government says, oh, well, we need to raise a bit of money, so maybe we could tax you guys a bit more. And then the glass industry was like, well, do you really want to do that? And they said, well, yeah, we do want to do that. And so they taxed glass manufacturing, and they taxed the amount of windows you would have in your house. You'd have to pay a tax on the basis of how many windows you had. So this window tax is famous for being one of the craziest taxes in history. And it's the reason why, if you sometimes find yourself in the UK, there are old Georgian and Queen Anne houses that have, where there should be a window, it's just a kind of a brick wall. It's like a blind window. It's because they bricked in the window to avoid paying the glass tax.
Old history of tax
300 years ago. Tax evasion or avoidance. That you still see them these days, blind windows. And ironically, because of the way that the kind of buildings are listed for their kind of authenticity, you're not allowed to take the bricks out and put windows in now. So that's part of the identity. But anyway, so as a result of that, partly, the British glass industry basically kind of shrunk to a rump of what it was before. And a lot of the innovations in glass in the kind of late 19th century, kind of mid to late 19th century, were happening instead elsewhere. And the main place they were happening in was in Germany, or Prussia, Thuringia as it was then. So it's eastern part of Germany. And thanks partly to kind of government investment, early forms of what you'd call industrial strategy, various different entrepreneurs, scientists set up some amazing companies. Carl Zeiss set up Zeiss. Otto Schott set up a company called Schott, which makes a lot of the really advanced glass these days, including stuff that goes into the borosilicate containers that all those COVID jabs went in. And between them, they made this amazing glass industry that became one of the world's biggest producers of binoculars, to the extent that by 1914, Britain was dependent on Germany for 60% of its binoculars. And at the time, no one in our country thought there was anything wrong with this. Germany's making this stuff better than we can. It's cheaper. So why don't we just buy all our binoculars from Germany? And that's kind of what happened. And then the war broke out, and it's the first great war where distance really mattered, and you were able to fire far further than the human eye could see. And so whether you had binoculars or a sniper scope or a telescope was a matter of life and death. And troops are being sent off to the trenches without binoculars because we couldn't get binoculars that we needed from Germany. It was called the glass famine. There were appeals launched in newspapers. Can you please donate binoculars to some of these troops who are going out? The King and Queen donated 4 pairs each of opera glasses. So you have this strange kind of idea of the troops going off with these gilt-edged opera glasses into the trenches. But this all actually happened. And it culminated in 1915 in that deal, where the spy was sent out to Switzerland, met with German counterparts and said, we want to buy binoculars off you. And the most extraordinary thing about this is it actually happened. They actually said yes. So they said, yeah, okay, if you want to know how good they are, you can obviously take some of the binoculars off the prisoners of war and just check them out. And the deal was done. And why was the deal done? It was done because Germany had lots of binoculars, but they didn't have enough rubber. So they needed rubber, natural rubber, for their fan belts and all of the different the tires and so on in their kind of machinery and in their vehicles. And because at that point Britain controlled most of kind of the Malaysian production of rubber, so you have this slightly miserable situation where two enemies are doing a deal to provide them with what they need to kill each other, basically. But for me, actually, the most striking thing about that story, the arc of that story, is towards the end of the war, Britain, which was once a big producer of binoculars, actually began to produce more binoculars again. So it did re-industrialize, so that by the end of the war, all of those old factories were repurposed and turned into binocular factories. And by the end of the war, Britain was producing more binoculars than it needed. It could provide some for some of its allies. And at the same time, Germany was making incredible advances with synthetic rubber. And so there is a kind of like a merit to this story, which is at a time of war, and the pandemic is another example, then sometimes you can have industrial leaps that in normal times you wouldn't. But maybe the best way of prosecuting that is not necessarily through tariffs, and it's maybe through industrial policy instead.
Yeah, so we can go there.
See how I ended there?
No, it's good. It's a great jump off point. And so I'm going to move a little bit quickly through some of the materials, because I think what I probably should have said up front is just the timeliness of this, given what's going on in the world right now, to help sort of tell the stories, not just of the way the material world works, but the way that the kind of global supply chains work in globalization. I think that's something that everybody would love to hear your thoughts on. So it's not going to shock everybody. Salt, you need it for your body to run. We have a specialty chemicals business, and so salt is a key precursor in so much of the chemicals world. Anything in particular on salt you want to?
Salt is maybe the most underrated of all the materials, because it's so ubiquitous and because it's there on your kitchen table. But it is the basis. It is the basis for entire families of chemicals. And the example I often think of is the chloralkali process.
Yeah.
Like how many people, when you kind of go up to someone in the street here and said, "What do you think of the chloralkali process?"
Yeah.
They look at you in a baffled way, understandably, or indeed any politician, or most business people. But if it's not for the chloralkali process, we're screwed. Well, there's this plant. So the chloralkali process is you're taking brine, so salty water, and you're using electrolysis to break it down into its component parts. So out of that brine, you end up getting chlorine, and you end up getting caustic soda as well. And those kinds of chemicals are essential for doing pretty much anything. If you want to process materials, break them down, then caustic soda is incredibly important for that. If you want to purify your drinking water, then you pretty much need chlorine. And so I went to this plant, there was one chloralkali plant left in the UK still running, because you can't easily ship chlorine.
Is that INEOS now?
It's INEOS, yeah. So it's another old bit of ICI that was bought by Jim Ratcliffe and is still going. This single plant is producing I think it's 98% of the chlorine that we use in our drinking water in the UK. And a guy, as we were walking around, it's this big cell room, uses a lot of power, uses more power than the city of Liverpool, they were keen to tell me. One room. And this guy said, well, if this place goes down, then within 7 days we're rationing drinking water in this country.
That's crazy.
Because you can't really import this stuff easily because it's so volatile.
That's wild.
And no one spends much time thinking about the diaspora of salt, and that's just the kind of chloralkali process. There's another process called the Solvay process, which is where you take salt and you turn it into soda ash, and that's what you need to make paper, to make glass. It's incredibly important, and it's a building block for making almost anything. If you're making batteries, to make lithium carbonate, so one form of lithium salt, you need soda ash. So soda ash is essential for the production of your batteries in most of the Chinese electric cars around the world. We in the UK have just stopped making soda ash. We don't make any of it anymore. We don't do it. It's just stopped. We're shipping it all in from the US because you can mine soda ash. There's quite a lot of mineral soda ash here, which is, but there's this other undercurrent of the book that's subtly there as well, which is that of all the countries in the world, the one with the most extraordinary endowment, both mineral but also economic, is America. Yeah. It has just such, compared with China has tried for decades to try and build like an iron ore industry and has failed to do it. America has this extraordinary mineral riches, whether it's kind of fracked oil, gas, even up in Canada. Am I allowed to include Canada as well?
My mother thinks so yes.
But uranium and all of these different things. America, rare earths. America doesn't need the rare earths from Ukraine because it has plenty of rare earths here if it could, wanted to process them. But the issue is,
the refining.
Do you want to do the refining? So America has all these riches. But yeah, we in Britain, we don't spend much time thinking about this stuff. We have deindustrialized even faster than America has, and I know that's it's a touch point. It is a big topic. It's an understandable topic because deindustrialization is real, and it's not something I think certainly some of the things that Donald Trump has said about that, he's got a point. Deindustrialization has been a problem for many parts of this country and ours as well.
Transitions are very hard. We went from an agricultural society to industrial society. This is our fourth or fifth energy transition right now.
Yeah.
Usually you're looking to address one issue. You often create new issues and sort of feels like we're in a similar place, but it's hard to solve problems if you can't accurately describe the situation. I think that's what's so important with what you're doing. You just touched on one of the themes I wanted to kind of get to at the end, but maybe we can kind of touch copper and lithium in the same time. What's the reason why China has been so gung-ho in terms of time, capital, effort in developing, kind of what I would describe as alternative energy sources? I mean, is there a geopolitical backdrop to why they have so many batteries and so many electrical vehicles and not as much oil, for example?
It's a really good question, and I don't think it's because of like a religious belief in net zero.
Right.
I think it's because they see, rationally.
Yeah.
And if there's one country in the world that has been thinking about what I call the material world, so just thinking
China.
about industrial strategy and how to build a supply chain, and how to understand what you're good at and what maybe you should be importing from elsewhere, it is China.
Yeah.
And China has been focused on this for a long time. I suspect that a lot of it has to do with energy independence.
Yeah.
So I would say that the chief thing. So energy dependence. At the moment, China is massively dependent on the Middle East for oil, and imagine being able to switch that so that so that every car in China isn't having to run on that Middle Eastern oil. That is massive as far as Beijing is concerned. Instead, it's able to run on batteries, and those batteries might well be charged up with coal. But China has lots of coal. Yeah. So I think that's got a lot to do with it. But I think the other side of it, which I think again, we are living through right now. If you think about what net zero demands of industry, it demands that it's taking a lot of very carbon intensive processes and trying to do them in a way that doesn't emit carbon, and that's so much harder than I think almost anyone appreciates, certainly within governments. When we in the UK were signing up to net zero, we were the first major economy to legally enshrine net zero in our laws. I know, because I know the people who were involved, they had no clue about what it would actually involve to get to net zero. It's incredibly hard. You're taking incredibly carbon intensive, energy intensive processes that go back 100 years, whether it's electrolysis or whether it's blast furnaces or whether it's all these things. There's a reason we're still using processes that are 100 years old in a lot of cases. It's because we just have not got anything better right now, and anything that we've got that is carbon neutral is really inefficient right now, and it might work in a laboratory, but it doesn't work at scale. And back to that point, that why did I choose these materials? It's because if you want to change the world, you need not just to be able to produce something in a laboratory, you need to be able to turn it out in massive quantities so it changes the world. That's the amazing thing about silicon chips. Each of us has in our pocket this little thing that contains billions of transistors, smaller than the size of coronavirus. Each of us has this in our pockets. And that is an industrial achievement that is way greater than some of the things that people get kind of misty-eyed about from the 1970s, like Concorde, supersonic flights. How many people went in Concorde? It's a tiny, teeniest fraction of the population. How many people have smartphones? It's pretty much everyone. And that changes the world. Sure. And so being able to do things at scale is all important. And the challenge of net zero is scale. Sure. And being able to do things at low carbon and scale is not easy at all. And China sees, in order to do that, that is a massive industrial challenge, but it's also a massive industrial opportunity. Sure. So if there is someone who can, crack lower carbon concrete, there is an extraordinary amount of research happening in China about that at the moment. So I think they see the opportunity side of it, and they see the kind of energy independent side of it, and they're much less interested in the kind of philosophy of net zero.
I mean, it makes sense. Tend to agree. I think what they also have is they don't have the political obstacles that much of the Western world has, right? I mean, having a real conversation of, let's just stipulate that we're not going to innovate the periodic table, and that's going to stay rather static. If we want to electrify, the world, we need more copper. I mean, we can just talk about where the copper sits, how you get it out, but the truth of the matter is you need a ton of carbon to get the copper out of the ground. It takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time. Not everybody wants a copper mine in their backyard, and we have political systems that make that a very, very healthy debate. So just legislating carbon neutrality in 2030 is a nice, kind of piece of paper with words on it, but physically it's effectively impossible to get done. Which is why at least we've been focused on trying to walk and chew gum at the same time, which is work on solar roofing, work on plastic chemical recycling, work on carbon sequestration sequestration through some of our aggregates, but we still make a lot of asphalt shingles, we still make FCC chemicals, and we're proud to do these things because it's what makes the world work.
Well, I think people's standard of living.
Yeah.
I think no one has signed up for a massive diminution in their standard of living.
No.
I think that's like people, and that's entirely understandable. You haven't really had any talk about the energy transitions of the past. What helped make those kind of virtuous transitions is that people's standards of living were improving.
Sure.
You know, when you were going from kind of wood to coal, there was a massive adaptation. We needed to improve the nature of chimneys because the chimneys that worked for a wood burning fire weren't very good for a coal. So there were all of these adaptations you had to do, and there was, we created a lot of pollution along the way, but people's standard of living was improving. And I think that if this can't be an experience where people feel their life is improving, then I think it's lost. It's lost from the start. If it's cast as a form of sacrifice, then I suspect it's kind of game over. But if there's an opportunity where people can feel that their standard of living is improving, that each of these processes is becoming kind of less pollutive as it goes, but they're still able to retain a standard, then that's massive. Totally. And I think that's often, but sorry to kind of go on, but one of the most inspiring things for me about kind of going into this world of understanding how things are made is in my world of economics. If you talk to economists, I spend a lot of time talking to economists, and for the last pretty much all of my kind of career, the last 20 years, the main thing people have moaned about is, oh, where's the productivity growth? We're in this productivity trap. There's no innovation. Have all the great innovations already happened? But when you kind of explore this world where people are making stuff, where they're kind of transforming raw materials that come out of the ground into amazing products, what you realize that a lot of the time is there are iterative improvements happening all the time. As learning curves kind of kick in, as you become more efficient at taking that raw material and turning it into. So the world is becoming a better place all the time. But because we're not focused on it, because we're not kind of looking at the nuts and bolts of our world, because we're focused on the services sector rather than that physical world where things are getting better. It may not be happening overnight. There may still be carbon emissions. It may not be an instant transformation, but things are definitely improving. If you're not focused on that, you don't see the amazingness of it.
Sure. Well, that's a very good prism to look at things. I know everybody's got a ton of questions, and I want to be sensitive to time, but do want to cover kind of two themes or topics before we turn it over. The first one is not the word tariff, but the word globalization. So maybe just focus on a couple things, whether it's, an ASML lithograph to, quartz in North Carolina. Can you give us a sense of for these 6 materials, singular geographic choke points that truly make decoupling not possible?
Okay, so the one that's in the book is perhaps the most obvious one. There's places like that plant I mentioned, which if it shuts down, then we're rationing drinking water in a few days' time. And there are the scary thing is there are more of those places than most people appreciate, and for the most part, policymakers only tend to discover them when something goes wrong. So it's when the plant shuts down and suddenly we don't have this stuff. And there are quite a few episodes of that having happened in the past. But the example in this book that's perhaps most obvious is, I talked earlier about the amazing journey that an atom of silicon has to go through from having kind of been dug out of the ground to being part of the silicon wafer that then goes into that amazing plant that Chris Miller will have told you all about. That journey, and like I say, it comes out of the ground as a kind of form of quartz, not sand, by the way. It's a lump of quartz. It gets put into an electric arc furnace where it's melted down, basically smelted. It's a form of smelting. It's like steel making. Remember, this is what we're talking about here is the computer chip in your smartphone or in your computer, or a solar panel, because they're made the same way. Quartz thrown into electric arc furnace, burnt alongside wood chips and coal, coking coal. So coal is part of the production process here for silicon chips and solar panels. Then you've got metallurgical silicon, as it's known. It's about 98, 99% pure. It sounds pretty pure, but it's not pure enough. So then that needs to be taken off again and processed again, turned into polysilicon. It goes through another process called the Siemens process. Then it's broken down all over again. It's almost reconstituted, atom by atom. At the end of that process, you've turned your 99% pure thing into something that's 99.999999999%, I think, pure. And that's polysilicon. And
give or take.
Give or take, yeah. There might be an extra 9 here or there. Sometimes it's 10 9, sometimes it's 11 or 12. But the point is, it is one of the pure, I think it's basically the purest thing that we make on a large scale as a species. But even that's not good enough because the atoms aren't in the right places. So then you need to break it down all over again, and you kind of melt it in this crucible, and you form it into this, what's known as a silicon boule. It all happens in an argon-filled chamber. There's amazing companies that are devoted entirely to this kind of thing. And what you end up at the end with at the end of that is something that is not just totally chemically pure, but also has this molecular perfect structure. When I said earlier about this being the most perfect thing we can mass produce, it is perfect. It is basically perfect to all extents and purposes. And they make this stuff every day. But in order to take that polysilicon, this kind of final stage of the process, and melt it down and then form it into the crystal, you need to melt it in this crucible, which also needs to be very pure. And it needs to be made of something called ultra-high purity quartz. And it so happens there is only one place on the planet that has a large supply of this stuff in the ground, where we get basically all of the high purity quartz for every crucible that melts every silicon chip and every solar panel in the world, and it's in North Carolina. One place, Spruce Pine, North Carolina, as perhaps is even more famous for providing the sand that goes into the bunkers at Augusta National Course that we saw just the other weekend, where a Brit won.
Yes.
So that's good. Every so often. But this is a single place which produces all of that high purity quartz. And there probably are other places which have, where the geology is propitious enough that you can find some of this stuff, but we haven't found them yet in large quantities. And just recently, when it was the hurricane, there was a hurricane that kind of blew through North Carolina just last year. It actually flooded a lot of spruce pine. It was terrible what happened there. And they managed to kind of clear it up, but for a period it was looking like this place is going down. And if this place goes down, then that is basically silicon wafer production, which means you can't then have the chip production. That's basically gone. And that is terrifying. And it's one of many pinch points. And to some extent, I mean, maybe it might, so I'm just starting to think about my next book, and I kind of want to think about more of these examples of places where you kind of don't think about them much ex ante. Like I say, usually it's when something goes wrong that you kind of notice, hang on, this place is pretty important. But there are so many more of these places than you really appreciate. And why is that? It's because globalization has this tendency, which I don't think is that much remarked on in like the economic literature, of if we can find somewhere that is able to produce something for as cheap as possible and do it very well, then we tend to kind of to concentrate a lot of our production in those places. It's a kind of natural monopoly. Like there's another example of this which isn't in the book. So there's this plant I went to in Birmingham in the UK, not Alabama, in the UK. It was famous for making pen nibs. So they used to make these nibs that go into fountain pens, and so they're really good at making very high precision flat metal. Okay, because if you're making a fountain pen nib, it needs to be absolutely the microns need to be in the right place so that the ink can flow. So that's their history. But these days, what they make, they do press metal, and they do it mostly for manufacturers. So they make stuff for car producers. They're making some of the motors, the metallic parts that go into those motors. When I went there, and when I visited, they were making this electrode. There's a long stream coming out of this machine of this very kind of flat pressed metal. I guess it must have been copper or zinc or something. And tiny little electrodes were coming out. And I said, what's that for? And they said, that is the electrode that goes into the rear view mirror of your car and activates the auto-dimming function. So if someone puts their kind of headlights behind you, then you don't get blinded because it does the auto-dimming. So most cars have these in their rear view mirrors. And this one factory in Birmingham is producing, it turns out, more than 50% of the global supply of that electrode that goes into rear view mirrors in cars. And this is in a country, we've deindustrialized faster than anyone else in the world. So if that's one tiny little lens on the way that globalization works and concentrates the production of everything into hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands of different places around the world, because there are hundreds of thousands of different places in the world which are making that little thing that no one has thought about. No one thought about the electrode that went into the rearview mirror of a car. But there are so many of these pinch points, and most of them are just totally kind of, no one is aware of them. And so, if anyone, this is my request, if anyone does encounter any of those stories about this little place making this little thing that no one else does, I think that's a story that needs to be told more, so I'm going to be focusing more on that.
Good. Well, it was remarkable to see how many of those examples are even in your book right now. Last kind of topic from me before we open up for questions, which is flip the coin. Now that we've kind of covered what's necessary, how do we deal with sustainability and climate and things of that sort? I mean, I think the kind of Iron chapter, more than any other, really kind of, depicted that conundrum between, quality of living and, environmental risk.
Well, I mean, I think if this roller coaster, this political roller coaster we're on at the moment, gets us into a healthier place where talk about, the environment and net zero is realistic rather than virtue signaling, and actually has a chance of success. Because if you look at, look at the various different plans, were any of these plans actually going to happen, even from some of the most ambitious governments? Our government was one of the most ambitious when it came to net zero. Look at the latest carbon budgets. We are not heading for the promise that we were making. And that's before any of the more recent changes in nuance that we're hearing from governments all around the world about how keen they are on these targets.
I think the original theory of peak oil was the 1980s.
Right, yeah. So we have, there's fashionable kind of theses that come along. But what's certainly true, and one of the facts that I find striking that's in the book is that if China were to switch, from coal to gas overnight, then you're basically there in terms of 2 degrees, or maybe even getting closer to 1.5. So even within the realms of what is possible right now, whether that's economical is a different question entirely, but so it's that issue of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think that we strayed quite far in the direction of, a lot of people planting flags rather than actually saying how we're going to get there. I hope now we can have a realistic conversation about how we can get there, how we can make it competitive, and how we can actually deploy some of the technologies that we have today to make the world a better place, which is what everyone
You've got a
wants.
bunch of people here who agree. So with that, I will maybe open it up to questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Ed and David. For those in the room, just raise your hand if you have a question. Those online can submit via the Q&A feature in the online event. We'll start in the room.
Maggie.
I'll give it to you next. Hi, thank you so much. This was an incredible and just wildly informative discussion, and your book is amazing, by the way. Bit of a non-technical question, given the discussion that we've just had, but I'm a mom of 2 young kids. Many of us in the room have families, and I think about the question that David asked at the beginning of being sort of divorced from the how do we bring people back to their roots, whether it's in what you're living every day, turning on the lights, getting dressed every day, eating food in your bodies. What advice would you give to parents, to people living in this world who want to sort of teach those coming up in this world to feel sort of a greater connectivity to the material world?
It's a really good question, and I'm a parent of kind of young children as well, and it's I think when you have young children, thinking about you're both struggling with this kind of there's just so much crap everywhere, and there's the kind of diapers and the all of the toilet roll and everything. It just feels like it doesn't feel like a very sustainable place a lot of the time. But the thing, like, when I was writing the book, I would kind of go to various like mines and stuff, and I would come back, or I've been to every salt mine in the UK, which is strange. I think I might be the only person. Let's assume so. But every time I'd kind of come back with some random little bit of stone, and sometimes it was a bit of salt, sometimes it was kind of ores that create metals, and they were my daughters were really inspired by the idea that something that could come out of the ground could then get turned into something else. And I think there is, I don't know about the education system in the US, but as our education system in the UK has just not been especially good at telling that story and telling it with wonder, because there is a story of wonder. There's a story of just amazingness, because everything we touch has this hidden life. And maybe it's the hidden life of how it was manufactured and where the parts came from and how they came out of the ground. I remember that thing about the silicon that's in your silicon chip. That was a lump of rock. It was a lump of rock, but very few people, even within the industry, had that curiosity to think, well, where was the rock? Where did it come out of the ground? And isn't the fact that we, as a species, are able to take a rock out of the ground and turn it into something that has more transistors in the space of your kind of thumbnail, than is kind of conceivable, the billions.
It's crazy.
Isn't that just extraordinary? And so I think that there is an inspiring story which is there to be told. And again, I hope that people kind of tell that more, because I think we want to. I found it actually quite a therapeutic process to just, at the end of this researching, I didn't have an exhaustive understanding of how the world works, but I was just that bit closer to it, and I thought I felt more in tune with the world, which I didn't expect it to be a kind of self-help process, but I did, because that's part of our story as humans, getting stuff out of the ground, turning it into tools, improving our standard of living. That's what we do. So I hope there are stories there that our children can be inspired by.
That's the inspirational answer. Mine is just go send them to a roofing company.
Yeah.
They're coming to take your kids to work day today.
Put them to work is the other version. Maggie, I think you're right.
Thank you. Thanks, Karen. Well, back to where you started, I joined from a long career in the media industry, and I can confirm that this is wildly more sexy and interesting than anything I did before in movies and TV. My question is along similar lines to my friend Dorit. You've talked a lot about how this has changed the way you look at things, whether it's a pencil or a rock or a table. Has this research changed your behaviors in any way, what you buy, what you do?
Yeah, I'm less. I used to be massively obsessed with getting the next iPhone or whatever gadget it was, and I think you can't go into the sausage factory of seeing how things are actually made and produced, and seeing the extent of energy that goes into them and the amount of emissions along the way, and then just think that one little iterative update of my phone is worth it. So I'm. We consume enormous amounts, and I think that there is a connection there, isn't there? That because we've divorced ourselves from the process of how stuff is made, like as a society, we're less conscious as consumers. And I think again, this is more kind of, I guess, airy-fairy than some of the stuff in the book. But I think that matters. I think it matters to have respect for the things that we are buying, and with the fact where recycling tends to fall down is invariably it's with the consumer. It's not with the businesses. Businesses like this like this one, steel manufacturer. Steel is like the best recycler in the world of any sector. Businesses are very conscious about recycling because obviously there's costs there. Consumers, and I certainly count myself amongst them, are not as conscious as they could be about recycling. And I think that's just because it just happens somewhere else. The making happens somewhere else. You order it, it gets made in China, and it turns up at your door, and you're just not thinking about what went into it, about that hidden life. But were you to spend more time thinking about that hidden life, then A, you respect it more, and B, it's just like it's a great story. It's this journey that everything has been on. So I think that's changed me a little bit.
Terrific.
I do still like gadgets, though. It's hard. Yeah. It's a hard addiction to.
I'm going to pull this back out of the softer stuff for a minute. It sounds inevitable that the geopolitical tensions are going to only increase to sort of secure the supply chains and the natural resources. And what the current administration, do you think this is a wake-up call for other nations, and how do you think this plays out over the next 5-10 years?
The funny thing is, so when I was researching this book, a lot of the places I go to, I go to kind of steel plants, I go to places, chemical plants and so on. And a lot of the conversations we would have would be about, oh, well, this electric arc furnace is like the cleanest one in this country. And now, subsequent to doing the book, I still go to steel plants. I quite enjoy it. But these days, in the last 6 months, the conversation is like, well, we're making steel, and this could be weapons-grade steel. Mm. And I went to an aluminum place the other day, and they were like, well, this could be going into fighter jets. And it's pretty unsettling. Yeah. That's kind of where the world is at the moment. The materials still matter enormously. They matter perhaps, like I was saying, they matter more than ever before. But it's like back to that, back to the 1915 kind of thing about the binoculars. So Britain in 1915 was dependent on Germany for 60% of our binoculars, something that we couldn't really properly wage war without those binoculars. Today, we, the US, the G7, are dependent on China for 80% of our batteries. And without batteries, you can't have drones. And drones are absolutely essential, as we're seeing, unfortunately, in Ukraine. They're essential to modern warfare. So I think you're totally on point. I think we are, as societies, going through that same revelation that I think people had in 1914, 15, that pure economics and pure price and the idea of just buying something from the other side of the world because it's cheapest, regardless of the consequences, that's not the full conversation. And that goes well beyond the realm of economics. That's a security thing. And I think we're now in that world where those two things are abutting against each other, which makes it very difficult to find a model to see where we head with this next.
I think we have time for maybe another question.
Yeah, we'll take one online
Yeah, sure.
to get to folks who are joining us virtually. So at multiple points in the book, untapped resources are found to have a lot of value. For example, making PVC cheaper. Are there any largely untapped waste systems that you think may be worth researching?
So untapped systems.
Waste systems?
Waste systems, oh gosh, yes. I mean, we're at the beginning. We're like, it seems to me, we're right at the beginning of this, I mean, I don't know if it's a new paradigm, but there's very little thought, apart from, in industries like steel and in some parts of industry where recycling has just quietly been embedded into the production process for a long time. I mean, that's the example I love to give is steel. Is like, no one sees steel as the great circular economy, but is the best example that we have in the world of circular economy. But other parts are just at that nascent stage. So like with battery recycling, and I kind of mentioned this a little bit in the book, there's this strange kind of interplay. We've spent a long time, or not a long time, batteries are still in their infancy, but so much of the focus in the first kind of 10 years of battery production was about making batteries so that they wouldn't kind of explode, understandably so, so that people would buy cars. But making them so they wouldn't explode involves quite a lot of putting a lot of kind of retardant, a lot of kind of solvents in there. All of that stuff makes it just harder to prize this stuff apart and recycle it at the end of it. And so to me, it seems like, if you're looking at all of these learning curves, and that's just kind of one example, you could look at so many different kind of forms of recycling. But it feels like for so many of them, you look at these learning curves of how we start off pretty inefficiently, and over time, we just learn by doing and get better and better and better, and our efficiency goes up, and you have this curve. It feels like for a lot of recycling, we're kind of right at the bottom of that curve, and there's more opportunities to come. which I'm kind of excited about. I think recycling is one of the areas where it's at, and so watch this space, I would say.
Well, we are going to end on an optimistic note there. Thank you, Ed. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for such a fascinating book, but mostly thank you for telling the story, because it's a super important story and more people need to hear it. So thank you all for being here.
Pleasure. Thank you.